So I think that we could get started. I have a little introductory information that I wanted to share. I know that there are some more people that might jump on, but good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the quarterly Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership virtual meeting. This is March 31st, 2021. I'm John Thompson. I'm the CRISP coordinator. I work at the Catskill Center based in Parkville, usually when I'm at my office. On the screen in front of you is my email address, also the CRISP website, and our Facebook address and our Twitter. So I encourage you to look at our website, look at the upcoming events that we have. We try to post them as soon as we have enough information to post. And then we also do that on Facebook. On the agenda today, we'll have a presentation by Andrea Dávalos on an upcoming research project she's working on. And after the presentation, our partners will have an opportunity to give updates on accomplishments this year and plans for the field season. So just a reminder to remember to mute yourselves, as feedback and background noise can interfere with others who may be speaking. And I'd like to draw your attention to the closed captioning that you should be seeing at the bottom of the screen. If you're not seeing it, there should be a button labeled CC, and you can click on the arrow by CC, and you can select full transcript, and the transcript will appear in a panel to the right of your screen. So moving to our next slide, we'll take a look at the agenda here. So our first item on the agenda is I'll give a little update on or a plug for a project that's going on and show a few of the upcoming events that we have. And then Andrea will give her presentation. Then after that, we'll have the partner updates and some 2021 announcements, and those will include Tom Algier from the New York State Department of Ag and Markets, who will update us on things going on with Part 575 and also all the work that's going on with spotted lanternfly. And Meredith Taylor wanted to give some updates on, she's working on a glyphosate alternatives project. They're developing an invasive species management strategy and her field season plans. And then Jennifer Dean wanted to give a IMAP invasives update. So I'm expecting we'll have a little bit more time if anybody else wanted to give an update, or if you have some events that you wanted to share, you could either put them in the chat or you could let us know just when we get to that part of the program. But we should be finished by 5:30 in any case, maybe a little bit before then. So we'll try to keep on track for all of the items that we have to go through today. And so here's the plug. We're looking for people that could search for spotted lanternfly. This is a project that's a collaboration between the New York IMAP Invasives Program and the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. It's having people adopt a block and go out and search for spotted lanternfly in certain areas. There's a grid system that I'll show you on the next slide in CRISP, where you can choose blocks that hopefully would be places that you would normally go to. They might be in your neighborhood. They might be at a trailhead that you go to go for a run, or you go to go for a hike. So there's lots available, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But up at the top of the screen, if you can see my cursor here, I'm just showing you a web page from the IMAP Invasives Program about the spotted lanternfly project. And then I'll point you to the webinar series here. There was a webinar that was recorded on February 23rd, which talks about spotted lanternfly, talks about how you would look for it, the methodology that you would use here, and what they're hoping that people will sign up for. So that's a great resource to learn about the program. And then there'll be another presentation that will come up on June 7th at 1 p.m. Registration will open up for that in a couple weeks. So just to give you an idea, this is the boundary of CRISP here. And each of these blue squares and the purple squares that you see in the CRISP region are open for adoption. The gray ones have been adopted here. So the blue ones are those are DEC properties, the trailheads, DEC campgrounds, and also the New York State parks that are within the CRISP region. And then the other color that you see more prominently, less prominently than the blue, but more prominently than some of the other colors, is the purple here. That shows blocks that have known tree of heaven, and there's a relationship between the spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. So as you can see from this map, I just wanted to point this out to you and give you an opportunity to sign up for these, but there's a few blocks that have been adopted, and they're gray, and those are in Ulster County and Otsego County, and there's a lot that haven't been adopted, especially within the blue line in this area. So take a look at that, go to the website, sign up for one that you could visit a few times this year. Right now, we're looking for spotted lanternfly egg masses. Dan Snyder and I have been collaborating with the Lower Hudson Prism and the Department of Ag and Markets to look for spotted lanternfly egg masses in Orange County. So we've been doing that, and we're hoping that more people will join in to help with this program. It's a great opportunity to go out and spend some time doing something that's really, really important. So I encourage you to be involved in doing that. And I just wanted to give a plug on some things that are going on. Tonight we have the headliner, Dan Snyder. He's giving a program on managing common garden invasives, and that's for the Woodstock Pollinator Project. The link to register is right here. I'll try to put those in the chat when I have a minute in a little bit. And then wanted to also let you know that the CRISP watershed stewards positions, there's some that are still open. That's offered through the SUNY Oneonta, that they're running the CRISP watershed stewards program. And to mention that we have the CRISP Summer Partners virtual meeting. I'm going to schedule that for June 2nd at 2 p.m. That'll be another Zoom meeting. I'll get the registration information up on our website, but we'll have Steve Young from the New York State Natural Heritage Program. He'll be talking about the rare species in the Catskills and their relationship to invasive species. So that should be a great program. Then, just as a reminder, New York State Invasive Species Awareness Week is June 6th to June 12th. So if you have programs that you want to do, please let us know. If we could collaborate on those, those would be great. And also, that's the same week as Play Clean Go week. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're organizing your programs during that week. Then also wanted to mention that the 2021 Schoharie Watershed Summit is virtual this year. It's free and open to the public. Dan Snyder and I did the first section for that summit. And the second section will be April 17th at 9 a.m. Dr. Gary Lovett from the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies will be doing a program, What's Bugging Our Forests, Impacts of Invasive Pests on the Functioning of Catskill Forests, and talk about how those invasive pests get here and what you could do about it to help stop them from getting here. So that should be a great program, and I'm looking forward to it. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'd like to introduce our speaker, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Andrea Dávalos. She's an assistant professor in the Biological Sciences Department at the State University of New York at Cortland. She had obtained her PhD in natural resources at Cornell University. Her research is motivated by a strong interest in conservation and the development of tools to restore natural ecosystems. She is particularly interested in addressing issues pertaining to the ecology and management of biological invasions and the factors that drive successful control programs. And she is part of a team that is working on a Catskill Science Collaborative Fellowship study. And today she'll be presenting passenger or driver gauging combined impacts of deer, invasive earthworms, and invasive plants. So you should already be able to share your screen, Andrea, and please proceed with your presentation when you're ready. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for inviting me. Please let me know if you cannot hear me. I can always adjust my microphone.
You sound great, and I can see your slide. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Also, as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, please, you can put them up on the chat, and then we will check them out at the end of the presentation so we can actually address all of them. I did change my my title a little bit. I decided to focus less on the data that I have already generated and tell you a little bit about the project that we're about to start in the Catskills that we are very, very excited about it, and give you a little bit of background information on jumping worms, which is the main goal or the main motivation to pursue this research. The figure that I have there is from The Atlantic. It's a piece that came out about jumping worms and their impact back in 2020. And it's a really informative piece. So if you're interested in the subject, I really recommend you to go and pursue it. So when we think about invasive species, we normally focus on the things that we can see. That is a large field of pale swallowwort or one of the swallowworts, and you can see, extends a very long or large area. It covers an extensive amount of fields in our state, and it seems to displace other vegetation. So obviously, our eyes and attention are geared towards those. But when we think about invasive species, sometimes the visible is not necessarily the most important or the ones that carry the most impact. And that's where earthworms might become really important. So in New York State, the majority of earthworms that you would find are not native. And as they invade or expand into forested areas, they can eat the leaf litter and transform the forest and transform the soil and upper soil layer, causing ecosystem impacts across scales and over large areas. So even though we might not see them as much, they definitely deserve our attention. So as I said before, many of the earthworms that you would encounter in New York State are not native. They're either, the current hypothesis is they're either introduced from Europe for some of them, like the nightcrawler, which is right here in the center. You can recognize it by that beaver tail, and it's probably one of the most common ones and the one that you won't be most familiar with. We use it for bait when we do fishing. But there's also some others that have been introduced from Asia, especially this group of jumping worms that encompasses two genus, but you can see them bound here. They look a little bit different, they act different, and they have different morphology and behavior and ecology, and they are less studied. So we are really interested in understanding what their impacts are and to really quantify their threat. There are also some native species in New York. Some of them are adapted to bogs or wetlands. I have never seen them. I'm still yet to see them. So most of the time, when you are in a forest environment, or you are working on your yard, or seeing them on the pavement, what you're going to be seeing is definitely not a native species, but a non-native species. So as I said, jumping worms are an emerging threat, and they are worrisome for land managers, for conservation scientists, as well as gardeners, golf in the golf industry, and they span a wide, um, you know, a wide set of professionals and avenues in which they are being of concern. The horticulture industry is one that comes to mind. They have lots of names that don't really relate to where they're from or what they do, from jumpers to snake worms to being crazy, being from Alabama or Georgia. They are not from any of those places. They're introduced from Asia. And we definitely cannot tell whether they're crazy or not. But that snake name and jumping name comes from a very particular behavior that they have, which is that when you try to grab them or when they are on the surface, they will have a snake-like motion. So they will move their body really fast and look a little bit like a snake. They come in from Asia, and in New York State, we have 3 species that are co-occurring, and they're the most common. And they're very difficult to tell apart just by morphological characteristics. Yet, when we've done more detailed analysis, we can see that they are usually co-occurring and they are widespread across the state. They were first introduced, we think, with the cherry trees that were given as a gift to in Washington, D.C. to 1912. So they were introduced in the early last century. And we do know that they were used in the Bronx Zoo to feed the platypus. So the picture there on the right, you can see a platypus being fed a worm. And there's some records that indicate that those worms were jumping worms. But right now, they are widespread throughout the Northeast. This is a map from 2018. Each one of the points represents a point where jumping worms has been identified. So you can see that it goes all the eastern, northeastern United States. It was believed at the beginning that they would not be able to expand into more northern forests. However, they have been found in Ontario, in southern Canada, and they are definitely in Maine, indicating that that is not a limitation for them. So since 2018, they've already been in Canada. So they're definitely expanding northward and expanding to the west and becoming more and more abundant. As I said, they're a little bit different than other species because they have a different behavior and a different natural history. This particular group are annual species, so kind of similar to a weed, right? They complete their whole life cycle in the single year. So if we start right now in May or June, you will be able to see juveniles. Those juveniles are not sexually reproductive yet. They are usually very, very small, between 1 and 3 centimeters. So that's less than an inch. And they will be on the top of the soil. So at this time of year, many of the worms that have been in the soil in yards come up with the first rains. And I always get questions about, are those the jumping worms? Usually those are not the jumping worms. If you see these worms that are really, really big in May and April, they're probably going to be lumbricids, so night crawlers and members of that particular family. As they continue to grow, they grow into the adult stage into July and October. In the adult stage, they can get much, much larger, up to 20 centimeters. And they will, when they are sexually mature, they develop a clitellum, which is like this ring of cream color that they have that's very close to their nose or to their front part. And that's where reproduction is happening and where fertilization would occur. Those adults at the end of October with the first frosts will die. And the only thing that would survive from these ones are going to be the eggs. So you can see a cocoon here that is an egg case. And that's how they're going to survive throughout the winter. When enough heat days have passed on, at some point in April, those cocoons are going to emerge and we will have new juveniles. So basically the population that we see this year is going to be dependent on how many cocoons were laid the year before or how many cocoons were able to survive the winter. You're usually going to find them in the top layer of the soil, contrary to other species of worms that might make these deeper tunnels and go deeper into the soil. The jumping worms are going to be mostly on the edge of the soil, on the top part of the soil, and they transform the soil and they look like pellets, a little bit like coffee grounds, grounded coffee. And you can see here on the picture at the bottom, they really transform that soil. When you step on it, it's almost like stepping on it's very, very soft. So it was like almost like foam. Your feet go down and up. They also have a very unique characteristic that they are parthenogenic, meaning that they don't need another individual necessarily to reproduce. So in theory, a single worm can establish a whole new population. And that's part of why the reason that they are concerning and worrisome. So in general, this is not only for jumping worms, but in general, what earthworms are going to do is completely transform our soils, transform the physical characteristics of the soil, as well as the chemical characteristics of the soil. They are going to be moving parts of the soil from the top layer to bottom layers. So they're going to be mixing those layers of the soil. They might end up increasing bulk density, degradation, and compaction of the soil, which at the end might have impacts on water dynamics and how the water is filtered through the ground. And ultimately, they might change the concentration and availability of nutrients that plants need in order to grow, especially those plants that are going to be, putting their roots in that top soil layer that is usually rich in organic matter. So a non-invaded soil would have a rich leaf layer at the top and very distinct layers, whereas a soil with lumbricids, like the nightcrawler in the center, you can see the middens and the castings. And then a soil with jumping worms might have more of that like pellet-like structure. So it might be easy to tell apart whether you're having an invasion by jumping worms versus a presence of other worms. So their impacts are not only on natural areas or protected areas, they are also impacts associated with horticulture and recreation. The pictures there show a study on Kentucky looking at their castings. I don't play golf, but I can imagine that would not be conducive to, a good game. They can definitely distract the ball when it is hit. So there's a lot of concern from golf managers and trying to develop an appropriate management technique. But also they might be very common in horticulture. And when we are buying plants for yards, when we are exchanging plants among gardeners, those worms can come in the soil as well as their cocoons. They can also be present in mulch, in waste, so garden refuse. Sometimes we'll carry them because if they are in the leaf litter, they will be carried on the containers where we bring in plants to our yards. So those are probably ways in which they spread and expand their habitat. The impacts are not only on industry, but also on the way our forests react. So this is mostly known from the lumbricids, so the night crawlers and families. As I said before, we don't know so much about what the jumping worms are doing, but we know that the soils change from a lot of fungi to more bacteria. We know that the root networks of the plants, where there's associations with fungi, the mycorrhiza, get disrupted. That they can change the sensitivity of the plant to drought. If all the leaf litter disappears or the plant gets pushed up because of the soil characteristics, then the roots can be exposed to drought, as well as changes in nutrient availability, which can then lead to higher or more widespread changes in the ecosystem and translate into changes into the plant communities. So some plants seem to do really well when there are worms present, especially grasses and sedges, but other plants seem to do not as well. Some of the woody seedlings, like the maple that is there on the picture, or some of the longleaf perennials that are going to be dependent on that deep organic soil. And to top of that, there's been some research that has shown an association between the worms and plant invasion. So where the worms are present, there seems to be a lot of plants, invaded plants, and vice versa. Again, most of this has been mostly documented for lumbricids, not necessarily for jumping worms. So we know that when we have stilt grass, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this new project, for example, when there's an abundance of stilt grass, usually we have abundance of worms. And we don't know which one causes which. We just know that it's an association. And when one is abundant, the other one tends to be abundant too. It might just be that they happen to be both at disturbed sites and it's a coincidence, or it might be that they are actually facilitating the invasion of these plant species. So ultimately, they have they trigger a set of changes in the ecosystem. So we know that they can have negative impact on native plant species in the understory, but they might be associated or having a positive association with invasive plants, which then will have a direct impact on millipedes and other soil invertebrates. If the worms are, especially with millipedes, the worms are competing for the same leaf litter. They are both detrivores. They're both eating things that are decomposing. So as that happens, then the worms are going to take in habitat and food from the millipedes. And there's work that's shown that jumping worms especially are negatively associated with millipedes, and they are negatively impacting millipedes. Also, as reducing the leaf litter, there's less habitat for soil invertebrates. There's also some impacts that have been quantified on ground nesting birds because of that change in the vegetation, because of the changes in the soil. There's some negative impacts there, and also some negative impacts quantified on salamanders. So salamanders can eat anything that comes through their mouth. So they would be able to feed on the smaller organisms, but not on the larger organisms, and that can create a type of ecological trap on them. So at the same time, we have this reducing impact of native species, which are negatively affected by the worms. And these indirect impacts and direct impacts from the worms to the salamanders and to the millipedes. And on top of this whole complication and combination of interactions, we can add white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer is a native species in Northeast North America. It's a herbivore. And as you probably are all very aware, it's a species that is quite abundant and has, its population has increased dramatically over the last century. They eat a lot. They are generalist herbivores, but they do have some preferences. So they do like some native species, some forbs that are long-leaved. So for example, they do really like these trillium plant species. And at the same time, many of the invasive species that are not really palatable for deer, meaning that they really don't like them. So they will not eat them. And because they don't eat these invasive species, and at the same time they eat the natives, they are releasing them from competition. And usually invasive species become more abundant where we have higher deer activity. So we have a complex set of different environmental factors, biotic and abiotic, like live and not live, that are interacting and determining what these organisms, the impacts of these organisms in the environment. So what we are aiming to do through this project is really ask a set of questions, trying to look at the relationship between the worms as well as the deer and the native species. So first, let's think about deer and invasive plants. So they can benefit. Deer consume the native plant species. They will seldom consume target invasive plant species. So they will not like your garlic mustard, your swallowwort, or many other species. They just don't like them. So the invasive plants will benefit from that reduced competition, which then will end up in a positive impact for the invasive plants. In that particular case, an example with Japanese steel grass. And this is a concept that I worked on a project a few years back, looking at what happened when we fenced areas. So we went out to West Point and we had 12 sites, and each one of these sites, we put up a fence, and then we had a paired open plot. And then we quantified the abundance of each one of these invasive plants. So the plots on the left are showing the year from 2008 to 2012. And then the abundance of the plant species, everything that is in the field square will be the fence plot where the deer do not have access. Everything that is on the circle, open circle, will be the open plot where deer have access. And let's focus on the bottom one, that is Japanese stilt grass. And you can see that at the beginning of the study, the abundance of Microstygium viminam was, or stilt grass, was similar between the open and the fence, but as time passed by, you can see that opening up, right? Such that in 2012 and 2011, we had significantly less Japanese stilt grass in the fence plot, whereas not in the open plot, there had been no change. So this indicates that stilt grass really benefits from that deer action, in that by excluding deer by itself or decreasing deer activity, we can definitely maybe manage stilt grass, or at least reduce its abundances. And this type of study and data and evidence has been collected by many other researchers in the field. So in this project in the Catskills, we are working together with Anne Dobson right now at Yale University, Tim McKay at Colgate, and a colleague of mine, Laura Ironman at SUNY Cortland. And we are asking, what are the relationships specifically between deer and Japanese stilt grass, as well as jumping worms? And we're focusing specifically on jumping worms because we know very little about these worms, and these worms are less known and their impacts less studied than for other worms. So what we propose to do is to find sites across the Catskill Mountains where fences have already been installed. We're looking for sites that have deer fences where we could do our project. So if you know of any and you're interested, please let us know, because we are actively seeking for those. At each one of those sites, we will look for another plot that will be very close by, that will be open, where deer can have access. And then we will come over the summer and monitor earthworms as well as Japanese stilt grass. To monitor the earthworms, we might be using a mustard solution. So this is a former student sampling for worms. And you can see we dilute mustard powder into water, and the mustard powder irritates the skin of the worms. So the worms come up, and as they come up and emerge, we can grab them. So it does not kill them. It's not a control method, but definitely allows us to get a relative abundance of the worms at a particular location. We would also use some monitoring to look at native and non-native vegetation, and especially to record the abundance of Japanese stilt grass. And then we will transplant sentinels of plant species. So we've selected 2 plant species that are native to the Catskills, and we're growing them right now in a greenhouse. And we plan to transplant them into these field sites and then monitor and see how well they're doing. So the plant sentinel approach is really, really good because it allows us to compare across sites. As you probably are very well aware, each site has its own vegetation, and it's very difficult to establish comparisons across sites, because one site may have a species, whereas the other one might not have. So by us bringing in the same species to every single site, we can establish those comparisons really well across sites. It's also a method that gives us a standardized measures, so allows us to evaluate whether we're being successful in our management. And it's easy data to take. It's really effective. Once you've put your seedlings in there, it's very easy to monitor, and you don't need a lot of scientific training. So I think this method has a lot of possibility of expanding as a management and assessment method for land managers and people that are not scientists. And hopefully it's something that we can expand on to work with land managers in the future. So what do we expect? If what we have seen in other sites holds, we would expect still a positive influence of deer on abundance of Japanese steelgrass, as well as the abundance of the worms. I did not go into details of that data, but there has been data from my former lab, as well as from other locations in Ohio, that have demonstrated when the fences are put up, the abundance of worms tend to go down. So we would expect those positive relationships between these stressors, which ultimately would have a combined effect on our plant sentinels. So we would so let's hypothetically assume that Japanese steelgrass has a negative impact on native vegetation in each one of our sentinels. So the axis here is depicting a negative impact, and the size of these bar, the size of that impact. So when our sentinel is growing with Japanese steelgrass, we will see a decrease in its performance. We will see a negative impact. We will probably also see a negative impact of the worms themselves, which can also be reducing the performance of the plant species. And on top of that, we have deer. So the three stressors are occurring at the same location in the same time. All of them are causing negative impacts. So the question we want to know is whether these impacts are going to be additive, so that we're just summing them, and that's the total of the impacts that we're seeing, or whether these impacts are going to be synergistic, meaning that they're going to be more than their simple addition. So they're more than expected. And hopefully through this study, then we're going to be able to tell these apart and quantify these combined, single and combined impacts of each one of these stressors. And all of these, I think at least will inspire a conversation about rethinking how we manage invasive plant management. We tend to remove invasive plants, but we know that's not sufficient to conserve native species. Really, there's need an effort for restoration and to manage the forces, the driving forces that are changing our environment. So if it's the worms, if it's the deer, or if it's the invasive plant, we really need to focus our management actions on whatever the driver of that change is. And that also should be paired with assessing our success. Like, we put so much time and effort in management invasive species. So really developing the right metrics of success and making sure that we take that data so we can learn from it and we can do it better next time. And we can actually achieve the goals that most of us have, which are related to preserve our environment and preserve the native species and the native organisms. So I would just like to end by saying that we really need to know what the underlying forces are in order to conserve plant populations in the wild, and not necessarily be focusing on what we're seeing as the most evident or the most abundant, but really understand what is driving the change that we see in the environment. And with that, I'll be happy to open up to questions and talk to you all. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Great, that was excellent, Andrea. That was a great presentation. A lot of information there and a lot of questions that you're going to be looking at. A real complex study that you'll be looking at. I had a question about, do we know, would these worms be more impactful? Or I guess the other way I should phrase it is, are there forests that are more vulnerable to earthworm invasions than others. For instance, northern hardwood forest, maybe with a lot of sugar maple, would that be more vulnerable to invasive earthworm invasion versus oak forest or a hemlock forest, for instance?
I don't think we have that type of data yet to answer that question, specifically in terms of jumping worms. We do know that they tend to be more abundant close to human development. So I think that as of now, I think will be the major predictor of where we're going to be able to find them. We do know that, for example, hemlock forests are not as a northern forest in the Adirondacks region, have very low earthworm abundance generally of the other groups of worms. So I would presume that because the soils are sandy, they don't have a lot of organic matter, still the jumping worms will not be as happy there. But we just don't have that level of data. And at this time, I think the most important thing is to consider where they're coming from and their closeness to these other locations of gardens and other points of introduction.
Great, thanks. Do we have other questions? I'm not seeing anything in the chat. You could raise your hand if you'd like. If you click on reactions, there should be a hand available, and then you should pop up and we should see you. But if somebody just wants to unmute and ask a question, I know we have a lot of inquisitive people on the line, so I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there.
Hi, John, it's Catherine Scalda from.
Hey, Catherine.
I just have a kind of questions about what type of exclosures that you have been looking at so far, and what I know that you said you were planning on putting the zigzag goldenrod and an oak species in them, and I was curious as to if those are the species that you would normally find in the exclosures that you presently have, and also if those exclosures already have, say, the stiltgrass and the jumping worms in them.
Yes. So ideally, we're looking for locations that would have an exclosure, would have Japanese knotweed, Japanese stiltgrass, and the jumping worm. And that's a big if, right? So we are scouting several sites, some of them owned by the DC, some of them close to the Catskill Center, where we think, at least we know there's Japanese stiltgrass and we know there's a fence. So we're gonna wait until later in April to try and see if the worms are there too. And in terms of how we selected the sentinels, we selected them because we know they are native to the area, even though in widespread. We also know that they have sensitivity for deer, so deer really like to eat them up. They're easy to propagate, so we can have them ready to put these. The Catskills Fellowship is a one summer fellowship for an undergraduate, so we need to be very conscious about what they can do and what we can achieve in 1 year. So these particular species are easy to propagate and will be easy to have them ready to put in our sites early in the summertime and be able to get some measurements by the fall. And we will mark them, so if they're already at the location at the fence, and we will know which ones are our individuals. And then remove them at the end of the experiment, for sure.
Thank you.
You may have said this, but are you looking for forested sites?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. So we would prefer to work on forested sites. And one thing that I did not go into is one aspect about the transformation of the forest, of the soil in these worms, is that they can affect the water percolation and the water filtering. So we are using lysimeters to look at the water quality at these locations. So we will be also installing some lysimeters and doing those water analysis.
We do have a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Andrea, but it's from.
Oh, how to slow their spread? I think that's the big question, right? I think a lot right now, there's a lot of research going on management, about management and what can we do. I don't know if you've heard about early bird. it's used as a fertilizer, but it seems to kill worms. So people in golf courses have been using them. Now, Early Bird has very clearly said that's not the function of our fertilizer and should not be used as a pesticide. And we also know that, we don't know what other repercussions it might have on natural environments. So we don't really have a control method. Once they are at a given location, it's very hard to get rid of them. We do know that the best option is prevention. So when you're getting plants into your home, when you're selling plants, when you're exchanging plants, when you are doing mulch, when you're going into a new location, check your boots, check your materials, wash your stuff. That will be the best approach that we can have. Together with the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, we form a little group of people working with jumping worms, and we've put together a document with some information for gardeners on how to prevent and manage for these worms. So I will send that to John, and he can, distribute among members of the partnership, and I think that will be helpful. But unfortunately, no, we don't have an appropriate method of management yet. I think education and prevention are our best tools.
Other questions? We have a few minutes. Someone must have another question.
How often they spread by our boots from one side to another? That's a great question. Like, I don't have like a specific number, right? But the cocoons are small enough that they can be attached to our boots. So you can definitely find them in there.
The reason I asked that question is I've hiked back in, way back behind Bel Air Mountain many times. And in the spring, there are incredible wildflower displays back there. And you're showing pictures of Trillium being negatively impacted by the jumping worms. And if people are like hiking back in there on those trails from the front country, they'll be carrying those spores back into the woods. And I'm wondering if those displays have been affected yet. Because I mean, it's obvious that if you find it at the Catskills Center in Oakville, that it's around other places too.
Yes. So I've seen in the Finger Lakes region, I've seen lots of locations that have cleaning stations, cleaning wood stations. And I think as similar to what we have with boats, right, that we wash them at cleaning locations, I think that trailheads, it would be a really good thing to add to trailheads, for example, cleaning, boot cleaning stations where people can clean up their boots before you come into the trail and head into the backwoods, so you don't bring them into those locations, because they can definitely be, the cocoons can last and survive for a very long time, and they can stay viable for the whole winter, so you can carry them inadvertently.
Are the cocoons only a winter survival mechanism, or do they form cocoons at other times?
So they will lay the eggs as soon as they become mature. And then they need a certain number of degree days in order for them to emerge. I think it's around 165. So usually they will not be able, like if the summer is long, if the spring is warm, they might be able to put in a second generation in the same summer. But the majority of the cocoons will overwinter as cocoons and then emerge the following spring.
And how many cocoons does a single worm make?
Oh, it can make in the hundreds over a whole season, yes. And then an egg case can have usually a single worm or multiple cases or multiple worms at the same time. And because the worms are parthenogenic, even if you have a single worm in the right location, you could establish a new population. Wow. So that's why it becomes really important, that cleaning of material.
Thank you. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you. So somebody's asking about the mustard. So you can build up, so the mustard again is a monitoring method just to see if they are present or they're not present. You can also look at them by using a rake. So you can rake on top of the soil and see how the worms are doing. But if you want to do the mustard, we usually buy a gallon of water and put a 2/3 of a cup of powdered mustard that you would buy at any supermarket. You mix it really well, and then you spread it over the soil, cleaning the leaves first. So clean up all the leaf litter, check on the leaf litter because some of these jumping worms are going to be in the top leaf litter. Check the leaf litter really carefully, and then you just pour it over the location, and the worms will start emerging. And you could, like, we do it sometimes with that metal frame, but you could also build something like with PVC pipes, like the ways we do it for vegetation, right? And it will work as well if you want to contain it within a certain area.
We do have another question, Michael Safran. Any benefit or way of treating your compost pile before spreading it?
There's some research coming out from Wisconsin that shows that if you heat things up well, so if you heat it up for 3 days, the exact temperature now escapes me, but I think it's 100 and it's above 100 Fahrenheit. So if you heat it up for 3 days, then the worms will die and the cocoons will die too. So what we've done, for example, is spread the soil or the mulch or the compost, whatever you're using, over a flat surface, and then put in plastic, like white or transparent plastic on top, and just let the sun bake it. And that all the worms will die in there. So, but that will work if you are trying to keep them out of a raised bed or a small area, but definitely would not work as a management method for a forest, right? So it will really work in particular areas when you want to protect particular raised beds or particular plantings of high value. Yeah, so I think, so we have a question on the chat about the worms in riverbanks. And I think that part of what we want to do in this study and another study that we're doing at Tuganok State Park, looking at the distribution of the worms, is that we think that one of their mechanisms of dispersal is through rivers and water, through streams and water. They seem to be on the riverbanks and very much associated with them. But we don't know. So we just don't have that information just yet. And it would be lovely information for us to start monitoring and looking at these worms and seeing if we can find them close to the riverbanks and whether they're using that as a mechanism of dispersal. But all the preliminary data points at that direction too.
Excellent. I think we'll leave it there. And we have, I think Tom Allgaier is coming up next. But thank you for your presentation, Andrea. I really appreciate you doing the presentation today and looking forward to working with you this summer.
Thank you. I look
Research.
forward to work with you all and meet you over the summer.
Yeah, thanks. And also, if anybody has any other ideas of potential sites for Andrea, to let me know or let her know. And then I know she's going out soon to look at sites that have already been volunteered. So Tom, it looks like you're sharing your slide, and you can go ahead.
Yep, I was hoping you could see it. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, I'm Tom Allgaier, I'm the invasive species coordinator with New York Ag and Markets. I'm just going to give a quick update on two things that we deal with, which is Part 575, inspections and violations. Part 575 is a DEC regulation. However, New York State Ag and Markets manages the inspections and violations for the plant side. DEC manages the animal side. And I'll also at the end give a quick update on what's going on with spotted lanternfly. So, all right. So in 2020, despite COVID and all the other issues and challenges that presented, our horticulture inspectors were still able to do 3,512 total grower dealer inspections. So those are registered nurseries, registered with the division, which is pretty much in line with other years past. So, I give them a lot of credit for getting out there, even with all the challenges of COVID and also the not distraction, but also the additional work of spotted lanternfly. So that was a secondary issue that drew horticulture inspectors away from doing the 575 inspections. Of those 3,500 or so inspections, only 379 of those inspections actually carried plants regulated under Part 575. So it's a much smaller number. Of those inspections, there were 59 violations. Most of those were for tagging, or the lack of tagging or improper tagging issues. So they were for regulated plant violations. Only 3 of them were prohibited plant violations. So a little bit of graphics here. You can see that the approximate number of inspections has remained the same, within that, 4 to 500 range at the last 3 years. The first year we kind of bumped it up because it was a new program, and since then we've dropped it down. But again, you can see the numbers between the 2018 and 2019 compared to last year. They're pretty similar, and the trend continues that compliance is still pretty high. So even though the number of inspections remain the same or roughly the same, the number of violations, whether they were regulated or prohibited, dropped down. So the prohibited violations, like I said, when you look at the total number of inspections, of violations, there's only been 375 total since the program began. So that's about 19% when you look at the overall numbers. Now, when you look at just the percentage of the 575 inspections, the compliance rate is 18%, which is unchanged from last year. So it's been a constant or consistent 18% rate for the last 2 years. And as far as last year, the compliance would have been at 15%. When you look at the total overall number of inspections, the violations are only a 2% fraction. So pretty successful as far as regulatory programs go. Last year, the prohibited content accounted for only 1% of the violations, so the total number of of inspections. You can kind of see the graph here where when the program was first introduced, things were a little bit higher, but as time goes on, we're gradually decreasing, and that's great for a regulatory program. It shows that the nursery trade is really, for the most part, being compliant. There will always be a few here and there, and most of the violations were, like I said, for labeling. Those issues were related to the nurseries out of state shipping it in without the labels or attached, and they just never got put on the plants, or that they didn't send them in with the labels. It's the originating nursery, regardless of what state it's in, is responsible for the nursery tags. And we're working with some nurseries out of state to increase that, increase compliance with those regulations. Jumping over to spotted lanternfly, this is the most current distribution map. So the area is in blue, and keep in mind it's not the entire county, but like so Ithaca is one small location, but the entire county is lit up blue, so it's not the entire county. Same thing goes for Westchester, and Sullivan and Orange County there. What we're looking for right now, I might as well say eggs and first instars. first instars. You can see the eggs in the top left corner here. So we're still continuing to survey for those, but the very, very tiny first instar nymphs will start to hatch out starting in April. We might still have a couple more weeks, especially with the cold weather we've had this week. So this little picture here looks pretty large, but he's actually that insect is actually perched on the tip of a spruce needle. So if you could picture the tip of a spruce needle and the size of the insect, very small, much like a tick, very hard to find in the environment. And when they first hatch, they disperse. They're kind of generalist feeders at first, and then they become more selective as they age. So right now we're looking at those first two life stages, the eggs and the first through third instars. We won't start seeing the nymphs with the red wing pads until later in the season, around July, when things start really warming up. And then the adults will start to emerge also around that same time. What we're concentrating on, as I said, egg masses. You can see there's variability. There's about 3 different color ranges here in the egg masses on the photo on the left. So we're still looking at those. Some of the covering is sloughed off over the winter. But on the undersides of objects, here's a rail that a railroad track. The underside of the rail is where the eggs were laid. Often it's a protected area on the underside of things. One of the things that scare us the most is recreation items like this camp chair. Looks very much like gypsy moth eggs, but these are spotted lanternfly eggs, and that chair can be picked up and brought to a camp, and they can hatch out, and that's the sort of spread scenario that we fear. As again, protected areas, this little former wound on this tree here, you can see that the egg mass, it's still glossy, a freshly laid egg mass kind of tucked under that bark in a protected area. So if you are out there surveying, look under things, behind cracks, underneath the bark, things like that. That's their preferred locations for egg masses, and also up higher in the trees. We've been using flashlights even in broad daylight. You can see here on these pine limbs, it blends in. It looks quite a lot like sap. We've been getting a lot of reports of sap, but it does resemble sap sometimes. So even a bright blue sky day, we're out there with flashlights to survey the underside of these pine limbs, and just so we can see the egg masses. So if you do go out, even though it's a sunny day, it might be good to bring a focusable flashlight, something as bright as you can manage. And that's really all I have. It was mentioned earlier about the program we have with IMAP, and we certainly encourage people to go out and survey. And I can't find my stop sharing.
Looks like you stopped sharing, Tom. Thanks for that update. It's really, I'm always interested in what you guys are doing, and it's great to look at some statistics of how things are working. And also, I saw that the spotted lanternfly summit information is getting shared around. I could put that on our listserv. I thought that was really interesting. A lot of information was presented about spotted lanternfly itself and about regulations and quarantines and things like that. So I'll share that through our listserv. But thanks for that update, Tom.
No problem. Currently, we're working on updating the internal the New York external quarantine, and we're also working on establishing an internal New York quarantine. That language is being approved, and hopefully that gets put in place soon.
Great, thanks, Tom. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but Meredith, are you going to show any slides, or are you just giving a verbal update? You're muted.
Thanks.
There you are.
I don't need to show any slides, but I do have a PDF I can share. So if you want, I could send that to you, and you can send it to anyone who's interested for the 2EE for Vaslin.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, no need to share.
We can do that. Go
So
ahead, Meredith.
thanks, John. John asked me to give a little bit of an update on what's been going on with the glyphosate ban. And I don't know how widely publicized it's been, but there was an amendment. We initially, at our last meeting, we discussed the ban that was going into effect December of this year that will restrict use of glyphosate on state-owned lands. And I had gotten involved a little bit with discussions regarding alternatives because we face proposed city council laws restricting glyphosate on city-owned lands as well. So that's something that's in the works. And so I just wanted to share a brief update. I'm trying to pull it up. So let's see here. It is, I had it up and now I can't find it. So the general information is that it will be allowed in certain situations for use on state lands where there's no risk to the applicator and it's being used for control of invasive species. So that is a positive change, but I don't know exactly how that's going to be applied for individual cases and how they will consider what risk is for the applicator. And I think there still will be an effort to look to alternatives where possible. But further conversations need to happen, I think, to determine how that's going to work out. And on the alternatives front, there was one big update. So New York City Parks, actually, I first heard from them that when they were restricted in their use of glyphosate, they have switched over in a lot of instances to the use of the triclopyr product Vaseline. And so when I looked into the labeled uses for Vaseline, there were only a small handful of species that were able to be used on label for Vaseline. And since then, I've heard from Tom Lewis of Trillium Invasive Species Management that he has gone ahead with FIFR 2EE registration for Vaseline. So there's a new species list that is available, and I can send that to John and he can share it with anyone who's interested. So that will cover the vast majority of invasive species, invasive plants that we're managing, and it increases the options for treating some of these species. And Vaseline is an aquatic herbicide. You're able to use it in and around water, so it increases the areas where you can use triclopyr products, which historically are very much restricted around water. So this is a new opportunity to explore a different product. And I should say also that it is quite a bit more expensive than glyphosate products. So not without its downside as well. So that's the big updates on the glyphosate changes, and I'll continue to share whatever I know. And if anyone else has more information, please feel free to jump in. And then just an update on our projects for this field season coming up. We are going to be hiring 2 summer part-time interns, and they will be doing a lot of work, particularly in the Ashokan Basin because of COVID-related travel restrictions. So I do have a number of projects lined up for them. And let's see, they'll be doing some continued work that we have started last year or the year before last to do the deer impact surveys as part of the AVID program. They're going to be continuing our ash monitoring plots surveys, looking for lingering ash. and surveying those monitoring plots for emerald ash borer. We will be initiating a new project surveying for invasive plants along our forest road system. So in the areas where we've had active forest management projects, looking along forest roads to see if any invasive species have come in on logging equipment, which typically is where we see new species coming in. So that will be some survey work. They'll continue the Ashokan Rail Trail surveys, focusing in on the parking areas that we haven't previously surveyed, and there has been quite a good bit of traffic at the Ashokan Rail Trail parking areas this year. And those are also prime locations to do spotted lanternfly surveys. So we will be including spotted lanternfly surveys there. And I was also interested in beginning to do more formal worm surveys. We've looked in the past for jumping worms, and I would like to do some more of that with whatever time we have available for that, as well as some continued Tree of Heaven surveys to have a better handle on where Tree of Heaven is found around the Ashokan Basin as well. And whatever time is left will be devoted to spotted lanternfly surveys beyond that. So that's a quick rundown of our summer field plans in the Catskills. Thanks, John.
Great, thanks. I had a question for you, Meredith. Were you establishing boot brush stations along the Ashokan Rail Trail? Are those
It's in the
established, or-
works. No, so I have all the justification and everything ready for that, ready to go as soon as the budget situation resolves itself a little bit. But yeah, no new funding is available for this year.
Okay. Thanks for the update. I appreciate it. And with that, we'll move on to Jennifer Dean, who's going to give an update for IMAPS.
Yeah, hi there. Let's see, how you doing? So yeah, and thanks John and Tom for mentioning the spotted lanternfly grid. So that's great. And even if you don't have a grid square close to where you are, feel free to go ahead and look, of course, and report your findings. You can report your presence or absence findings in IMAP. Just a note about field season prep. So, thinking about, how you're prioritizing where to look and what kind of data tools to use. We have a couple good resources on our website that compare the different mobile apps that we now have available. So in addition to the simple, IMAP app that I think everyone's gotten very used to now that does the presence or absence points, we now have tools to help you collect polygon data for treatments and surveys and so forth. And Mitch from our team just recorded a webinar earlier today going through some of those different things. And so that should have been recorded and will be up on our site on the YouTube channel before too long. Or you can always reach out and there's a nice little comparison chart on our website looking at the different tools that are available. One thing that we've been working a lot on, and some of you have heard from us on this end, is the species tiers project. And I know CRISP has been very involved in creating a tiers list over the past 2 or 3 or 4 years. You've been updating it on a regular basis. And so we've had our graduate student from SUNY ESF, Dylan Finley, who's been working on standardizing this across all the prisms and across the state. And so he's wrapping that up. He's actually defending in 3 or 4 weeks. And he will be presenting on the next statewide PRISM monthly call. So in April, I think that's April 28th, I believe. And then
yes,
there's also going to be an online table that has all the tier results. So it'd be hopefully a really great resource for everyone who's looking to have easy access to comparing all the tiers between the different prisms and at the state level, and of course it's something we'll be updating each year, but it's been a really cool project. He's done a lot of neat data analysis components to it. And so definitely tune into that PRISM call next month. And another thing that we've been working on at the Heritage Program is a statewide aquatics vulnerability modeling project. And so this is tapping into some of the spatial modeling expertise that we have at the program. Tim Howard and Amy Conley have been working on this. And so hopefully that'll be helpful for prisms as it's not done yet, but it will be soon, but it'll be helpful for prisms, looking at different factors of what makes water bodies vulnerable from a statewide perspective. And then if there's, I think, John, you had mentioned that there's a project coming online soon, some researchers working on a prism specific one. So, we're hoping that these kind of projects will help feed into each other, and, the regionally specific ones will always, of course, have different data sets than a statewide specific one. But it should be great for everyone to be able to tap into those kind of modeling projects. And then one last note, it might have actually already happened, but it will at least happen in the next 24 hours if it hasn't yet. There's going to be an IMAP maintenance downtime. And so if you log in and, or it might not even let you log in, it hopefully won't be too long, but I know the programmers are doing some updates, and clear your cache. And if, which is usually, I think, Control-Shift-Delete for most browsers. And if you see anything really wonky, definitely let us know, reach out to us, and we'll check in with the programmers and make sure there's no lingering bugs in the system. All right, that's it. Thanks, John.
Thank you. That's great stuff. Yeah, Dylan's done a lot of work, and it's been nice working with him. It's been that's an amazing project that he's done.
Yeah, a lot of data wrangling.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Did anyone else want to add anything to updates or announcements? I'll give people a few seconds if they did want to say something, but not hearing anything. I would like to thank Andrea again for an excellent presentation. And like I said, I'm really excited about the work that they'll be doing. That's a great team of people that we'll have working in the Catskills. So really thankful that the fellowship has worked out to get that research started. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining this CRISP virtual meeting. We do these quarterly. The next one, as I mentioned, will be June 2nd. We'll have Steve Young talking about rare species and invasive species in the Catskills. And as soon as I set up that meeting, I'll share that information on our listserv, on our Facebook page, and on our website. So with that, I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us. And I hope everybody has a safe and happy spring, and take care. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.